Well, that was extraordinary. And brings me to two quick things I wanted to say to start. First, Doug, it's great to see you, sort of. And I'm really sorry that you're not here, both because I really wanted to catch up with you, but also to tell you in person how much I appreciate the very, very important work that you're doing these days, that I commend to everyone, which you've just given us an example of, and ask you to please keep it up. We need it. That was extraordinary. I'd rather just sit in silence for a while. Also, to our alumni that are here, I want to echo Joe Atkinson's and others' sentiments about how glad I am that you are here. And what a shot in the arm, in fact, it is for us. It's no secret these are very difficult times in the church. I have thought for the whole of the 11 years that I've been here what a sign of hope you are to me. I had no idea how much hope would be needed. But I really appreciate your presence. You have no idea what your presence here does for us. It reminds me of much happier days when I was younger and thinner and had more hair, for one thing. Anyway, thank you. The dreaded frontal assault on Humanae Vitae, which many feared in the year of its 50th anniversary, has not yet come to pass, thanks be to God. Instead, we have seen a subtler, albeit still recognizable, guerrilla action in the confused aftermath of Amoris Laetitia, less dramatic perhaps, but ultimately no less concerning. In line with a certain interpretation of that document, which we have heard much about, it has become typical of some whom Janet Smith calls the discerners, to praise the teaching of Humanae Vitae as an ideal, now regarded as a lofty aspiration rather than an a priori and efficacious ontological reality, while simultaneously insisting that this ideal must be subjected to a principle of discernment and appropriated by degrees, or not, in light of concrete circumstances. Preeminently, this means the difficult circumstances of couples who are just doing the best they can, but also the historical circumstances surrounding the encyclical's promulgation and presumably qualifying its authority. How this principle does not simply devolve into situation ethics and ultimately vitiate the entirety of the Church's moral teaching remains unclear. It does not take a great act of imagination, especially given the nature of the present ecclesial crisis, to foresee what else might be rationalized under this approach. But as that is beyond my scope, I will leave it in the imagination. Though the discerner's approach and the understanding of conscience entailed by it were rejected in advance in the forgotten encyclical Veritatis Splendor, it may be worthwhile, nevertheless, to reflect a bit on this notion of circumstances in both its senses, the historical circumstances from which Humanae Vitae emerged, and the very notion of concrete circumstances assumed by the discerners. The crisis in moral theology occasioned by this encyclical arguably obscures its historical significance. For Humanae Vitae does not just deepen and clarify traditional moral norms in the realm of sexual morality, though obviously it does that. It also launches a new tradition of magisterial teaching on what John Paul II called the man of the epoch of progress. Looking at the encyclical from within this register will, I hope, help us to appreciate more deeply what is ontologically at stake in it, which is nothing less than man and the reality of God and the whole of Catholic faith. In other words, everything. Cardinal Cafaro reminded us that Humanae Vitae was occasioned not simply by the need to reassert the Church's opposition to contraception against its widespread use, but by a technological development, the advent of chemical contraception. And it is significant that the opening paragraphs of Humanae Vitae place this development within an interpretation of the broader meaning of our historical epoch. Of the many revolutionary developments of the 20th century, Paul VI writes, quote, "The most remarkable of all is to be seen in man's stupendous progress in the domination and rational organization of the forces of nature, to the point that he is endeavoring to extend this control over every aspect of his own life, over his body, over his mind and emotions, over his social life, and even over the laws that regulate the transmission of life." This was not a novel assessment. Gaudium et Spes had already declared that, quote, "the human race is involved in a new stage of history, triggered by the intelligence and creative energies of man. These energies, quote, recoil upon him, upon his decisions and desires, both individual and collective, and upon his manner of thinking and acting with respect to things and people, end quote. The spiritual agitation and changing conditions of life in this new era spring from modern science and technology, which have transformed beyond recognition both the theoretical and practical orders. This ambivalence towards technological society would mark the remainder of Paul VI's pontificate. He worried that the opening which the 1960s seemed to offer to Christian transcendence might in reality be, quote, the more accentuated sliding towards a new positivism, universalized technology as the dominant form of activity, as the overwhelming pattern of existence, even as a language, without the question of its meaning really being asked, end quote. John Paul II would soon echo this worry, observing in Redemptor Hominis that, quote, the man of today seems ever to be under threat from what he produces. This seems to make up the main chapter of the drama of present-day human existence in its broadest and universal dimension, the Pope says. Benedict XVI, taking up the theme, would later explain that technology is never merely technology. Because it objectifies man's subjectivity, it, quote, tends to become an ideological power that threatens to confine us within an a priori that holds us back from encountering being and truth. Were that to happen, we would all know and evaluate and make decisions about our life situations from within a technocratic cultural perspective to which we would belong structurally, without ever being able to discover a meaning not of our own making, end quote. Pope Francis seems convinced that this technological confinement has already come to pass, at least judging from Laudato Si. He laments, quote, the way that humanity has taken up technology and its development according to an undifferentiated and one-dimensional paradigm. This paradigm exalts the concept of a subject who approaches and gains control over an external object. The subject makes every effort to establish the scientific and experimental method, which in itself is already a technique of possession, mastery, and transformation, end quote. He calls this the technocratic paradigm, which sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as a mere given, as an object of utility, as raw material to be hammered into a useful shape, end quote. So powerful is it that, quote, the idea of promoting a different cultural paradigm and employing technology as a mere instrument is nowadays inconceivable. The technocratic paradigm has become so dominant that it would be difficult to do without its resources, and even more difficult to utilize them without being dominated by their internal logic. It is amazing in retrospect how the question occasioned by chemical contraception was from the very first embedded within the question concerning technology. And it is equally amazing how oblivious proponents of a change in church teaching were to this fact then and now. This is all the more striking given the history of the 20th century. Man's endeavor to control every aspect of his own life did not begin when the contraceptive pill dropped miraculously from the sky. This ambition is latent in modern conceptions of nature and science. It acquired a new and urgent impetus with the 1871 publication of Darwin's Descent of Man, with its proto-eugenical anxiety that our evolved benevolence permitted the Irish to breed like rabbits, thereby thwarting natural selection's favoritism toward the English. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, would soon coin the term eugenics to name the endeavor to set things right. It found political expression in the progressive era of the 1920s and 30s, with its dream of a society collectively organized for the pursuit of scientific progress. And it proceeded unabated until the atrocities of the Second World War forced a change of names, if not intent. The Galton Chair of Eugenics at University College London, for example, became the Galton Chair of Genetics. Genetic hygiene became genetic counseling, and so on. The forced sterilization laws that prevailed on both sides of the Atlantic are a well-known artifact of this era, as was the international birth control movement. Less well-known, perhaps, but even more remarkable, is the fusion of progressive era Christianity and the eugenic ideal. It's unlikely that eugenics could have so flourished otherwise, to the point that prominent Protestant ministers in the U.S. would compete with one another in sermon contests sponsored by the American Eugenics Society. The Christian asks, how many, how healthy, according to the prominent Episcopal clergyman Philip Osgood. Christine Rosen has documented this remarkable story in her Preaching Eugenics, while Amy Laura Hall has shown how deeply American Christians of every class, all over the country, internalized this eugenical idea, dramatically reducing their family sizes within a generation, anxiously measuring their children by the new standards of scientific parenting, and parading their families about like livestock at the county fair in fitter family competitions around the country, while trusted household brands like Lysol subtly marketed themselves as contraceptives to women of my grandmother's generation. Amazing. Catholics, otherwise the staunchest opponents of eugenics, were not invulnerable to the eugenical temptation, despite the fact that they were more likely, at least west of the English Channel, to be the objects of it. But according to Christine Rosen, among all faiths, quote, the evidence yields a clear pattern about who elected to support eugenic-style reforms and who did not. Religious leaders pursued eugenics precisely when they moved away from traditional religious tenets. The liberals and modernists in their respective faiths, those who challenged their churches to conform to modern circumstances, became the eugenics movement's most enthusiastic supporters, end quote. The mindset forged during the eugenics era formed the cultural backdrop to the notorious decision of the Lambeth Conference in 1930 and the promulgation of Casta Connubii that same year. And its expectation formed part of the calculation in the first use of the phrase responsible parenthood that I or Google have so far been able to find in a 1963 policy statement of the National Council of Churches in the U.S. Yet for all this talk of discerning and reading the signs of the times, antagonists of Humanae Vitae then and now exhibit a striking lack of historical consciousness and a stunning failure to learn the lessons of the first half of the 20th century, which were mostly forgotten between the discovery of the concentration camps and the discovery of the double helix. Nor do they seem to share Paul VI's ambivalence about our technological future. The early debate over Humanae Vitae, though occasioned by man's technical dominion, shows little interest in the meaning of this dominion or what is truly novel in it. No thought was given to the difference between modern technology and ancient techne, or to technology as a social system and a regime of necessity. Little effort was made to situate the advent of the contraceptive pill within its larger scientific and social history. Nor was there any real analysis of the massive social and economic transformation that defined the parameters of responsibility and impelled great masses of people toward contraception in the first place. Instead, the Papal Commission final report justified its reform proposals partly on grounds that, quote, man's tremendous technical progress and control of matter by technical means and the universal and total intercommunication that has been achieved correspond perfectly to the divine decrees. End quote. It spoke with great and, in retrospect, naive self-assurance about mature and responsible collaboration with, quote, men of learning and science to control matter and intervene in the biological process of nature, at the very moment that eminent men of learning and science, enthralled with the possibilities of the new genetic science, were unashamedly contemplating a new eugenics, more powerful but less obviously authoritarian than the old. It is very difficult, in fact, to distinguish the operative understanding of dominion in the majority report from that of the National Academy of Sciences, which was just then fantasizing anew about guiding human evolution. It is as if there had been no Nazi medical experiments, no International Eugenics Congress, no Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory, no Buck versus Bell, no birth control leagues, no social hygiene movement. It is as if Chesterton and Lewis and Huxley had never issued their warnings about the shape of things to come. It is as if there were no Crick and Watson lurking in the shadows and no Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe waiting just over the horizon. It is as if Casta Connubii and Humanae Vitae pertained merely to the private decisions of individual couples and were not integrally related to Catholic social teaching, a lasting misconception corrected by Benedict XVI in Caritas and Veritatis, or as if the social forces commending universal contraception were not the same forces that preoccupied the Church's social magisterium. Whenever the discerners invoke, quote, concrete circumstances against the abstractions of nature and doctrine, it is assuredly not these circumstances that they refer to. And yet it seems an oddly abstract notion of concreteness that would bracket out the moral judgments and decisions of couples as so many discrete moral decisions, from the actual historical and ideological conditions that give them these specific choices, that invest these choices with meaning, and that make their choosing compulsory. Not to mention abstracting from the ontological order that we actually inhabit. This abstract concreteness results in a kind of ahistorical presentism, comprised merely of discrete decisions and atomic facts, the most decisive of which are ultimately the couple's momentary and finite self-understanding. Veritatis Splendor indicates where this inevitably leads, to a form of pastoral care scarcely distinguishable from therapy, and a moralistic ethics of authenticity that reductively separates questions of sexual morality both from their ontological and anthropological basis and from their historical circumstances as they actually are. As the progressive moralism currently in the ascendancy within the church makes its peace with the sexual revolution, it conceals the true nature of these circumstances in the name of valorizing them, obscuring the fact that the sexual revolution is the technological revolution applied inwardly to our self-understanding and outwardly to our bodies and those of our children. That it is not merely a loosening of the obligations of traditional sexual morality, but a revolution in our fundamental ontology, our archetypal self-understanding, and an interminable war against the human being as a creature of God, that is to say, as human. It represents a profound failure to grasp the meaning of modernity and thus a failure of philosophical self-knowledge. Little wonder then that it fails to grasp the full depth of this new era of magisterial teaching, as Pope Benedict calls it, inaugurated by this encyclical, or to appreciate the dangers in compromising it. 50 years on, that danger should still be more obvious. Every social ill prophesied by Humanae Vitae has come to pass, and some which the encyclical did not foresee. We are witnessing in our time not only the abolition of man, but of woman also. The technological disassembly of the one act of conjugal love into discrete unitive and procreative dimensions has now made it possible to manufacture children for whom the once natural question, "Who is my mother?" has no obvious natural answer. If the prediction of Stanford Law and Genetics professor Henry Greeley are correct, it will soon be possible to manufacture children descended from no adults who have ever lived, but from embryos created for the purpose of harvesting their gametes. Each of the various assaults on the humanum, contraception, abortion, same-sex marriage, artificial reproduction, surrogacy, genetic screening, germline manipulation, the manufacture of defective research embryos, human-animal hybrids, gender theory, and gender reassignment, may belong to different and perhaps novel moral species, and no doubt careful discernment is needed to determine which. But they spring from the same ontological and anthropological root and perpetuate the same anthropological and ontological lie. And they are not just the discrete acts, discrete moral or immoral acts of individuals and couples. They form a seamless garment, to coin a phrase. Increasingly, they are interdependent and mutually reinforcing elements of a complex adaptive social system, an evolving biotechnocracy, if you will, whose dynamic exigencies govern us more deeply and comprehensively than the rule of law. And you cannot abstract and affirm one element of this system, say LGBT identity, without simultaneously implicating yourself in the technologically enabled redefinition of man, woman, and child entailed by this affirmation. This system is technological in at least two senses. Practically speaking, the technological conquest of human biology is the practical precondition for all of these phenomena. Same-sex marriage would have remained permanently unimaginable without the possibility of giving same-sex couples children by technological means, a requirement for so-called marriage equality, irrespective of whether any particular couple decides to avail themselves of this right. We could never have imagined that a man might really be a woman if we did not also imagine that it were technologically possible for us to transform him into one. Yet these phenomena also suggest more deeply that technology has entered into the theoretical heart of our fundamental ontology and our very self-understanding, into the way that we conceive of being, nature, knowledge, and truth. If technology is indeed the ontology of the age, as George Grant once said, then a moral critique of technology which merely evaluates its uses, such as that presupposed by the progressive majority on the Papal Commission, will not suffice. for it will fail, as indeed it did fail, to grasp what technology has become for us. Technology is not merely a collection of neutral tools, external and subservient to us, that we can then use badly or well, although, of course, there's some truth to that. It is rather the milieu in which we now live and move and have our being, a regime of necessity that determines the very conditions of our thought and action. Hans Jonas helps us to understand on the plane of technological order the dictum of St. Augustine and the ancients that those who lust for domination end up dominated by it. Control, he explains, by making ever more things available for more kinds of uses, enmeshes the user's life in ever more dependencies on external objects. There is no other way of exercising the power than by making oneself available to the uses of things as they become available. Tasks for theory are thus set by the practical results of its preceding use, their solutions to be turned again to use, and so on. As these products and their exigencies succeed each other, accumulate, and extend themselves across time and space, Jonas says, quote, the situation for later subjects and their choices of action will be progressively different from that of the initial agent, and evermore the fated product of what was done before, end quote. To glimpse the power of this fate over our thought and action, one need only to look at any of 1,000 bioethical dilemmas and how they govern even what it means for us now to think about life and death. Those exigencies determine from the outset what is and is not a question for us. And just the expectation that the mysterium tremendum of life and death will yield itself to scientific analysis, which now has the sole authority for the intelligibility of nature, determines the very manner in which these questions, which of course determines in advance the shape of the answers. There would be no urgent need to identify and isolate an analytically discrete moment of conception accurate to the fraction of a second from a continuum of events that begins with the conjugal embrace of man and woman and concludes with the eventual birth of a child, were it not for our ability to dissociate, analyze, intervene in, and manipulate the various stages of that project or that process. Excluded from the outset of this picture, which imagines time in a Humean way as a densely packed series of instances extrinsically related to each other, is the possibility that there might be a distinction between ontological and temporal origins in the child's historical genesis, and that the creation of the child, like the creation of the world, might therefore have an atemporal or supratemporal dimension. In that event, while one would have to concede a boundary distinguishing a before which and an after which in the child's coming to be, one would also have to concede that in coming upon that boundary, we will have always arrived too late, because the simple unity of the creature's being as an unum per se is not a unity of aggregation, because unlike an artifact, this unity is the source and not just the outcome of this development. Excluded, in other words, is the possibility that we might really be creatures in a theologically robust sense that informs our very ontological structure or alters the terms of analysis. But what happens if this happens to be true, or even to be our deepest truth? We have no way of discovering it by means of what now counts as reason. This problem is mirrored at the other end of the life, as the controversy over brain death attests. Here we run the opposite risk of having arrived too early at the boundary between dying and having died. Yet there would be no great hurry in the first place, no need to draw this boundary so clearly and distinctly, were it not for our ability to prolong life artificially and to harvest organs, and if extraordinary costs did not accompany extraordinary measures. Tasks for theory are set by the practical results of its preceding use, their solutions to be turned again to use, and so on. We can perhaps see better why Jonas considers this dynamic a fate if we carry this foregoing line of analysis further into the realm of human moral action. We remain free within certain parameters to choose whether to avail ourselves of the available technological possibilities. But none of us is free of having to choose, from having to take up a stance with respect to these technologies in the face of powerful but subtle forms of systematic social coercion that shape our choices. A woman who wishes to succeed in the workforce will have to choose whether to contracept. but her choices are powerfully framed by the availability of chemical contraceptions, a standard part of the regime of so-called reproductive health, and the market's expectation that she will use them. These expectations are more coercive than we usually perceive, for they operate internally as well as externally. They redefine the archetypal relation between every woman and her own body, irrespective of the choice of any particular woman. Representing that relation is a field of technical possibilities subject to individual choices that in reality are anything but. This representation, it's important to see, defines the collective imaginary in a way that shapes a woman's self-experience prior to her conscious choice. I've got another example, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time, having to do with genetic screening and amniocentesis. Such examples show the human and cognitive underside of technology as a social system, organized for collective inquiry, in Dewey's words, for which no one in particular is responsible. A system that more nearly resembles Bacon's New Atlantis than Locke's Second Treatise, which I would argue the New Atlantis is really most accurately depicts what liberalism is. It is an open-ended system that attacks nature collectively, he says, and therefore progressively, where work in one branch of the sciences, say IVF technology, contributes to unforeseeable and uncontrollable achievements in a second field, such as genetics, though of course this is too simple. The cause and effect trains set in motion by technocratic processes do not follow a linear chain reaction, but multiply virally in multiple directions at once, like an organism increasing its bulk in 3 dimensions. The natural telos of technocracy is thus biotechnocracy, both because technology as a social system takes on a life of its own as a complex adaptive system whose ensemble behavior is irreducible to and ultimately uncontrollable by the human beings who initiate it, and because human beings are not simply the subject of its irreversible processes, but its object as well. Technological revolution thus reaches its apex in sexual revolution, where it is turned inwardly upon our self-understanding and outwardly upon our bodies and our children's. Where did this brave new world come from? According to Benedict XVI, this new era is rooted in the founding assumptions of the modern age. Quote, the new correlation of experiment and method that enables man to arrive at an interpretation of nature in conformity with its laws, and thus finally to achieve the triumph of art over nature. Our modern word technology, which fuses techne and logos, making and knowing, expresses this correlation. Technology is first a way of apprehending the world before it is a collection of instruments. This is presumably why Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm an epistemological paradigm. This new technological manner of knowing is a knowing by doing that takes experience apart and analyzes it, in Bacon's words, abstracting the intelligible wholes that present themselves to our experience from the totality to which they actually belong, indeed from the actual order of esse commune, breaking them down so as to reduce them to their simplest components and reconstructing them as the sum of those abstracted components and their interactions. This is the meaning of the famous Baconian maxim, knowledge is power. Not that we know the phenomena of nature simply for the sake of controlling them, but rather that we know natural phenomena by means of controlling them. Bacon therefore says that truth and usefulness come to the same thing, and Benedict XVI that truth has come to be seen as coinciding with the possible, because the truth of this kind of knowledge is precisely identical to our power, to our success in replicating experimental results, producing new experiments, and manipulating these phenomena to our own end. With the conflation of knowledge and power, of truth and utility, truth is essentially whatever is technically possible. But the ultimate limits of possibility, of course, can only be discovered by perpetually transgressing the present limits of possibility. The technocratic paradigm thus instigates an interminable and systematic revolution against all forms of antecedent order, including our own nature, paradoxically giving this revolution the stability of an institutional form. This technocratic paradigm now determines what it means for us to think, as we have already begun to see. It makes traditional theoretical and contemplative reason obsolete, both because it deprives contemplation of its objects and because the new conflation of truth and possibility makes such speculation superfluous. if by manipulating variable x I can produce or inhibit result y, and if y then allows me to proceed to experiment z, it's really pointless to ask what a cause or knowledge or truth or even an entity is, or even what x, y, and z are. As Dewey says, they are what they can do and what can be done with them. The triumph of art over nature presupposes the conflation of art and nature, which means that the technocratic paradigm is not merely epistemological, but ontological as well. And I'm looking over this really quickly to see how much of this I want to read, because I'm in the interest of time. I think I'm just going to throw 3 pages away. This may turn my paper into a tohu avohu, a formless void. Is that right, Joe? Close enough? Close enough? My Hebrew is not very good. I'm sure some crucial point that's essential for all the rest you've now missed. But the scientific revolution, which commenced in the 17th century and has not ended, was a revolution against any metaphysics that would place form or mind or logos or meaning as the foundation of reality, and any concept of nature that made wholeness an autonomous cause with respect to its component parts. At the root of this revolution was a new notion of matter, liberated from form and conceived, albeit with variations, as some sort of dimensive and hence measurable quantity, the insensate order of Pope Francis's analysis. The abolition of substantial form effectively eliminated the distinction between ontological and temporal orders, thereby paving the way for the conflation of being and history and the triumph of time over eternity that was soon to follow. But it also evacuated natural things of just the indivisible a priori unity, interiority, and inherent intelligibility, which had heretofore distinguished them from artifacts, qualities that would henceforth be invisible to the eyes of science. Natural things became artificial and therefore plastic, limited in their functions and transformations only by the bounds of the possible, which science perpetually transgresses. For according to Bacon, the task and purpose of human power is to generate and superinduce on a given body a new nature or natures within these bounds. As nature becomes a machine, so the knowledge of nature becomes engineering. The technological gaze upon the world has given us enormous control over nature, or at least the illusion of control. Since the systematic processes introduced into the stream of history by our power recoil upon every facet of our lives and elude our control by their very nature as processes. Nevertheless, this alleged control over nature has come at the price of a profound bifurcation inserted into the very heart of nature and indeed into the very heart of man himself. The original exemplar of this tendency is Descartes' famous dualism of thinking and extended substance, now universally denied in theory but practically affirmed in every reductive analysis, as the analyst temporarily exempts himself from his own reduction and retreats to an Archimedean point outside of nature in the very moment of his theorizing. Yet Descartes simply provides the form for all the dualisms which seem to issue from this technological ontology in a seemingly endless series. Dualisms between primary and secondary qualities, nature and nurture, scientific biology and folk biology, between replicators and vehicles, between DNA software and cellular hardware, between the sexually differentiated body and its sexual orientation, and of course now, between a merely biological sex and any number of socially constructed genders. This proliferating fragmentation is made possible by a technological ontology which seeks to make all things possible except two: the true thought of the Creator God, radically transcendent and therefore radically immanent, who knows and loves the world into being from nothing and endows it with meaning, and the human person as a per se unity of body and soul, corpore et anima unus, who in his very being is both image and participant in this creative knowledge and love. The teaching of Humanae Vitae stands in sharp contrast to the technocratic paradigm in both its objective dimensions as a philosophy of nature, the ontological paradigm, and its subjective dimensions as a way of apprehending reality, the epistemological paradigm of which Pope Francis speaks. Against this backdrop, the teaching of Humanae Vitae 12 on the inseparable connection between the unitive and procreative significance of the marriage act appears as a defense of the reality of the human person as a per se unity of body and soul, both against his ontological bifurcation into biological and affective dimensions, and against the absolutization of partial perspectives that accompany this thinking, be they, quote, of the biological or psychological, the demographic or sociological orders, end quote. Karol Wojtyła rightly worried that the men of our day were not prepared to comprehend the full truth about man. As Veritatis Splendor 47 and 48 clearly saw, it was ironically only by presupposing a physicalist understanding of the body and its subhuman biological laws and rhythms that uncomprehending critics were able to then charge the encyclical with physicalism. And this tendency persists today in thinkers like Salzman and Lawler, or in the carefully calculated thoughtlessness of Father James Martin, who wishes to liberate affectivity from the meaning of the sexually differentiated body. Wojtyła was a strong defender of the encyclical's anthropological vision and a sharp critic of the sufficiency of those partial perspectives even before he became pope. And these were to be enduring themes of his pontificate. In Love and Responsibility, he wrote, quote, "The expression order of nature cannot be confused nor identified with the expression biological order, as the latter, even though also signifying human nature, denotes it only inasmuch as it is accessible for the empirical descriptive methods of natural sciences. However, the biological order, as a work of the human mind separating some elements of this order from what really exists, has man as its immediate author. The order of nature, by contrast, constitutes a group of cosmic relations that occur among beings that really exist. It is thus the order of existence, and the whole order present in existence finds its basis in the one who is the unceasing source of this existence, in God the Creator," end quote. He would echo these thoughts as Pope in his 1996 message on evolution to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, insisting that with man, quote, "we find ourselves facing a different ontological order, an ontological leap, we could say. For the passage into the spiritual realm," he continues, "is not something that could be observed in this way," end quote. These passages illuminate the meaning of the partiality of those perspectives alluded to in Humanae Vitae 7. Partial or limited will not just mean incomplete, but abstract, reductive, and superficial, unless they can be incorporated into a more comprehensive metaphysical and theological horizon, and into the fullness of the actuality from which they originally exempted themselves. This integration cannot be impossible as a matter of principle, but is extraordinarily painful, difficult, and we must say unlikely, given the ontology that we have already seen to be inscribed into them. For to admit the spiritual realm is to acknowledge more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamt of in biology, psychology, demography, or sociology. Things, in fact, which cannot be apprehended by these functional two-dimensional thought forms. Joe Sachs puts the point perfectly in his introduction to Aristotle's De Anima, quote, "That inward depth of life that opens in perception cannot be found on or between the extended surfaces of bodies. And when we cut bodies open, all we find on their insides is more outsides. Nor can we recover this inward depth simply by adding the spiritual realm to the biological, but only by recognizing that the spiritual is the full truth of the body, of which modern biology is but the selective, technocratically conceived representation." Almost done. In his 1978 article on the anthropological vision of Humanae Vitae, Wojtyła correlates with these partial perspectives with a familiar form of reductionism, by now familiar. He writes, quote, "This is particularly important in the present field." Okay, you know what? I'm going to skip that. It's long. It's Cartesian dualism. But I will say this because it ties into my next paragraph. It is precisely here, he says, among other things, that the problem and the practice of the technique of contraception is situated. Situated here, this is me, not him, because the procreative act which contraception impedes is not bifurcated this way in reality. Rather, it is, if we may borrow another term from Hans Jonas, quote, "the maximum of concrete ontological completeness known to us," where history, my history, and indeed the whole history of the species, are recapitulated and projected into the future, where interiority and exteriority, natural man and ethical man, heaven and earth, time and eternity, and everything else that Adrian says is going on, are united in the indivisible nexus of a single actuality. The exercise of conjugal sexuality when it is fertile, Cardinal Caffarra says, constitutes the mysterious tangential point between the created universe of being and God's created love. It is even the point at which this creative love comes within the created universe of being, with a view to the new term of its potency. Hence, he continues, the fertility inherent in the conjugal act is not merely a biological fact. It brings the spouses objectively into a real relationship with God the Creator, whether or not they are conscious of this fact, end quote. Which surely means that Adrian is also right to suggest in his provocative suggestion that Mary's virginal conception is in some way archetypal for all human conception, inasmuch as Mary's is an exemplary and willing participation in God's creative generativity. Notice how this understanding of the actual world, especially as it is concentrated here, reverses the perspective of the discerners. It is the full truth about man, what he actually is in the fullness of his natural and historical dimensions and in relation to God, that is concrete, because it's reality itself. It is the partial perspectives, which reduce reality to an abstract collection of atomized empirical facts, and which thereby makes the relation to God that is constitutive of every circumstance into a hypothetical and effectively unreal reality that is abstract. Cardinal Caffarra therefore maintains that what is really at stake in the teaching of Humanae Vitae is the cause of God and man. He says, when the truth taught by Humanae Vitae became obscured in the conscience of contemporary man, this could not fail to bring about inevitably a profound crisis in understanding of his relationship to God the Creator, a relationship that is the heart at one and the same time of metaphysical reflection, of ethical reflection, and religious experience. The harm in violating the principle of inseparability in Humanae Vitae 12 is therefore obvious. The various forms of this violation can differ in species and gravity, but each perpetuates an ontological lie, and thus an act of violence against both being and reason, harming and blinding those who commit them and the society which countenances them. Each proceeds as if the body were not an intelligible sign, but merely a brute fact void of intrinsic and specifically human meaning. Contraception, the separation of sexuality from procreation, does violence to the couple and their love, undermining this reciprocal indwelling of the unitive and procreative meanings that places the realization of the unitive precisely at the heart of the procreative and vice versa. Assisted reproductive technologies, the separation of procreation from sexuality, compound the violence by two additional assaults on the child, who in the very act of his conception is treated as if he were not a person, the incommunicably proper existence of a spiritual nature and the fruit of his parents' love, but were merely an object to be tested, selected, and worked upon. We lament that this regime often leads to experimentation on embryos, but we lament too late, because the very conditions under which the embryo is produced and the fact that it is impossible to collect longitudinal data on it beforehand dooms him to live as an experiment of a system of collective violence against nature that, unlike the embryo's parents, is unburdened either by love or responsibility. More frightening even than this brave new world, at least to me, is the harm done to reason itself, to our capacity, though it be through a glass and darkly, to see God in all things, and to see in all things something of what God sees. This vision was once the very goal of the Christian life. Generation after generation, many prophets and righteous men have longed to see it. But the eclipse of the sense of God in our technological modernity, which so worried John Paul II and Benedict, puts into question not only our capacity, but even our desire to see it. That's the most troubling thing. The question that we ought to keep before us, and the question that, in fact, in different ways has haunted everyone who has contemplated this brave new world, Huxley, Lewis, Orwell, and I would add Joseph Ratzinger, is that is the question of what it is no longer possible for us to see and think about. Like Joe, I've been thinking a lot lately about Romans 1, about what St. Paul calls the darkening of the mind that follows the exchanging of the truth of God for a lie, and how difficult it is to regain your sight once you've gouged your eyes out. When man loses sight of the comprehensive horizon of creation, he loses sight of the interior horizon of his humanity. Eventually, he comes to view all circumstances within a narrow and abstract frame, the affective, the empirical, the psychological, or the social, that drains them of their full human meaning because it has drained them of their divine meaning. Inevitably, then, what Wojtyła calls ethical man is subordinated to, and if not killed off, by economic or technical man, who, quote, in the name of the premises of that same progress in the dominion and organization of the forces of the natural world, would like to take a position with respect to himself, to his own humanity, not foreseeing that a position of this kind could include in itself a certain alienation from what is decisive for his very being, end quote. The meaning of the technocratic paradigm in which we now live and move and have our being cannot be apprehended by the forms of knowledge which this paradigm has produced, which are constitutively incapable of thinking the ontological question, what is, but can only pose the functional questions, how many, how far, by what influence, and to what effect. This is especially important for us to recall in our time of pastoral conversions and paradigm shifts, lest pastoral become a synonym for thoughtless, and we wake up one day to discover that the paradigm we have actually shifted into is very different from the one that we intended. It was the same Pope who promulgated Gaudium et Spes, after all, who said, "The world is in trouble because of the lack of thinking." Nothing could be more disastrous right now than for the church to give up on thinking, to renounce our inherent Platonism, and to replace philosophy and theology, her native tongue, with the partial and superficial perspectives of a biology or a sociology or a psychology or a political science or economics or, God forbid, a journalism generated from within the technological mind. To do so would be to surrender the world to its technological fate and so to betray the commission of the Good Shepherd by abandoning his flock to the wolves. Truth is the intelligible face of being. It is being. It is not abstract. Indeed, we have seen that truth is the most concrete thing, that only the truth about God and the human person fully grounds us in reality and thus saves us from the reductive machinations of our biotechnocracy. To neglect the truth, therefore, of this encyclical, Humanae Vitae, is not only to acquiesce in an ontological lie, but to become an unwitting accomplice in the triumph of the technocratic paradigm. To adhere to the truth of this encyclical, however, is to recall the teaching of that other forgotten encyclical, that truth is the condition of freedom. Thank you.